You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 10th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up on today's programme.
We're going to win Wisconsin. We're going to defeat Comrade Kamala Harris.
In many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man. But the consequences of putting Donald Trump back in the White House are extremely serious.
Harris and Trump prepare to face off in their first and possibly only presidential debate, as the polls show they're in a dead heat.
Mr. Trouble is there.
Ukraine launches a wave of drones into Russia, but is there any sign of the stalemate shifting? And as the United Nations prepares for its General Assembly, is it still fit for purpose given the conflicts around the world? Plus, is a motionless wind turbine the answer to dubious claims about rotating blades? All that right here on The Briefing with me, Vincent McAviney. Now, Kamala Harris will be making final preparations today for her first presidential debate with Donald Trump tonight in Philadelphia. Remarkably, the two have never actually met in person, with Trump having skipped President Biden's inauguration. If there's one thing that is undeniable, it's that Trump has previously turned in the most consequential presidential debate performances in recent history. His tactics against Clinton thwarted her campaign, forcing her into an early retirement, and forced Joe Biden into a one-term presidency. So how should Kamala Harris take on Don? Joining us now is Julie Norman, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at UCL. Julie, thanks for joining us. The latest polls show this race is neck and neck. It's uncertain if there will be any more debates. Is this the biggest opportunity to make a breakthrough for either candidate?
Well, it certainly seems that way. I mean, normally I think we look at debates and say, oh, maybe they don't matter that much. People have already made up their minds. But obviously the June debate that really started the process of Biden's withdrawal from the race obviously indicated what an effect they can have. This debate in particular really is Kamala Harris's main opportunity to introduce herself fully to uncertain voters and to even those who are leaning towards voting towards her. Aside from the convention, this is really the opportunity for her to let people know who she is, let people know where she stands, which is something that polls are saying people want. And also for people to hear from Trump, unless someone is attending Trump rallies or following him, on Fox News and outlets that are, covering him a lot. A lot of people still haven't heard from Trump with his hard line of questioning as well. So I would say for both of them, it's an important day. And I would just point out, too, early voting is going to be starting in the U.S. this month. So even though we think about the election being in November, voters are going to make their decisions very quickly after this debate.
Yeah, 9 years after descending that golden escalator onto the political stage, there's no one who doesn't know who Donald Trump is and what his platform, as much as he has one beyond self-interest, actually is. But despite being vice president, many people still say they don't really know much about Kamala Harris. Should she be focusing tonight just not on Trump, ignore him, and just introduce herself and her platform?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's two schools of thought on this. One is that when it really comes down to it, what will motivate voters to vote for Kamala Harris is a vote against Donald Trump and to really try and needle him, to get her full prosecutor mode in full force, et cetera. But others are saying that that's actually a distraction, that she should focus on communicating herself. Trump is a somewhat known quantity, and just focus on really speaking to those few undecided voters in those key swing states who, at the end of the day, are going to swing the election. So I think she's probably going to get advice both directions, and it'll be interesting to see what tack she takes.
And Kamala Harris has apparently been locked away in mock debates for days. But can anyone really prepare for the unpredictability of Donald Trump?
It's a good question, and we've seen that in previous debates, obviously, with different opponents. I will say, for this debate, they are planning to mute the mics when the person is not speaking. So it will be a slightly different format than some previous ones where there were interruptions and these kinds of things. But you're right. He's obviously, because he's such an unorthodox character, it's hard to prep, I think, to debate him. But Harris has been in some tough debates before. It's often a format where she does overperform. And again, everyone will be watching to see if she does that tonight.
Yeah, you've mentioned there's been a battle over whether the mic should be hot. The Biden team argued they should be turned off when the other is speaking. That was seen as actually helping Trump. Harris's team have been trying to get them switched on the whole time, but they're sticking with them off. What do you think is actually best? Because you've touched on it already. There are a lot of people who since 2020 have simply removed Donald Trump from their lives. But when you actually, as we sometimes have to do as journalists, have to listen to a full Trump rally, I mean, this is a very different candidate. As much was being made about Joe Biden's decline with age, Donald Trump in 2020 versus 2024 is a very different specimen.
Yeah, it's true. And I think the Harris campaign was hoping to draw that out a bit. That's where there was that back and forth about the mics. I think they thought that her debate style would be stronger if she could counter some of his claims, if she could intervene in some of his points, things that Biden, was unable to do in the debate. And he got a lot of criticism for that. But with that said, these were terms that were agreed several months ago. At the end of the day, they just said, fine, we'll go ahead with what the terms were. But it does change this. It will change the pace of the debate and just kind of the format of it. And it'll be interesting to see how she navigates that. But she'll have been prepared for that, I think, by this point.
One of the differences from Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, which was lent heavily into, the suffragette movement and women's rights and smashing the glass ceiling and all of that, that's something that Kamala Harris really hasn't engaged with. But an iconic moment from her debate against Mike Pence was when he was talking over her and she just simply said, I'm speaking. And a lot of women resonated with that, where, it was a man trying to mansplain to a woman, speaking over her. Do you think tonight, she can make much of the fact that she is a female candidate with the issues like abortion on the line, and that Donald Trump will have to be wary that if he does try and talk over her, it'll look bad for him with a lot of female voters?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one of the ideas that has been tossed around before this debate, that Trump needs to be careful about, making himself look bad with certain demographics he's trying to attract, but also for Kamala, how much to lean into the identity elements of what make her an exciting candidate for some people more so than, say, policy issues. So far, her campaign and Kamala personally have lent more into the policies and saying, look, I want people to vote for me because they see me as the best person for the job, not because I'm a certain, sex, gender, race, et cetera. And that seems to be where they are sticking and seems to be what's resonating most with voters right now. So I think we'll see it come out more in how she responds to certain issues like abortion, like some of the other questions she'll probably get, but without making that a forefront point in the way it was back in 2016 with Hillary.
And finally, pivoting to this side of the Atlantic, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is visiting London with Labour's new government in position for the first time. There's been a slight shift in the UK approach on Israel, with some weapons licenses being revoked. And there is a widening gap in allowing Ukraine to use long-range missiles. Do you think we might see a kind of slightly different relationship between Washington and London today at all?
Well, I think it's an important meeting today. I mean, it's kind of the last big meeting, I assume, that Blinken will be over here. Obviously, one of the first big meetings with the new Labour government. And there's just these important, multiple important issues on the table that these two allies have been very intertwined with. My guess is that Ukraine will probably be the main item of discussion today, with trying to agree on some ways forward there, some with battlefield strategy, as you said, with long range, with removing restrictions for long range weapons into Russia, but also some of the economic elements as well, with trying to tighten some of the sanctions on Russia in that regard. But the Middle East, China, the Indo-Pacific, all those are going to be on the table and are going to be part of what we're hearing is going to be a new kind of strategic dialogue, an open dialogue between the U.S. and the UK, which I think is important for the Biden administration to put in place now before November.
Julie Norman, thank you. Now here's Tom Webb with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Vincent. At least 40 people have been killed in an overnight Israeli strike on a humanitarian zone created to shelter displaced people in southern Gaza. This is according to local rescue officials, in what Israel has said was an operation targeting Hamas fighters in the area. Gaza's civil defense says its first responders recovered 40 bodies from the strike and were still looking for people. A global summit in South Korea has announced a blueprint for action to govern responsible use of artificial intelligence in the military. It was not immediately clear how many of the 96 nations that sent government representatives to the summit, including the United States and China, who were endorsing the document. And Pope Francis's final Mass in East Timor has drawn 600,000 people, nearly half of the southeast nation's population. The huge turnout comes despite local anger over a demolition drive and the high cost associated with his visit. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Vincent.
Thanks, Tom. Russian officials claim to have shot down 144 Ukrainian drones overnight in a wave of attacks that have killed one woman, set residential buildings on fire and grounded flights in Moscow. Joining us now to discuss this is Monocle's writer and researcher Julia Lassica. Julia, this feels like quite a big offensive by Ukraine.
Yeah, definitely. One of the biggest attacks on Russian soil by Ukrainians in terms of long-range strikes in the war so far, full-scale invasion so far. So 9 different Russian regions were affected. The drones seem to all have been, or most of them were heading towards Moscow region, and the biggest hits were taken by the regions that kind of are on the way to Moscow from Ukraine. There were images circulating on social media, as you said, of residential buildings on fire. We assume that's from debris that was falling, the drones that were shot down. And I think Ukraine is really showcasing here as well its capability, without using Western weapons, its own homegrown long-range drone missiles that they have been developing. They're really showcasing their ability to use that on Russian targets.
And do we know if the drones were targeting anything specifically like energy or refinery infrastructure, or is that just trying to play to make people in Moscow wake up to what's going on?
I think the latter, definitely. This was centred on Moscow. This wasn't a refinery or energy infrastructure attack in the same way as we've seen before. I think that Ukraine is playing a double game here when they do strikes like this on Russian territory. One is to impact the actual war effort itself, energy infrastructure that is, creating Russian profits that can be then fed into missile production and arms production. Here, I think it was a political statement about Moscow residents not feeling like the war is far away from them. I think stepping out onto the streets in Moscow, St. Petersburg, other major Russian cities, lots of people comment that there doesn't seem to be a war going on. Perhaps you'll see a bit of propaganda here and there, but there isn't the same feeling as you get in Ukrainian cities, and it's about bringing the war home. Ukrainian President Zelensky has said that this is a very concerted effort on Ukrainian part to make Russians feel what war is like.
And Russian drones have made incursions into NATO airspace this week. What was the response like?
Yes, so there were 2 Russian drones that ended up in NATO territory yesterday, one in Latvia, in the eastern border with Belarus, and one in Romania. In the Romanian section, that sort of made less headlines, surprisingly, although it should make headlines, because this isn't the first time it's happened. Romania has been fallen victim to this, as well as Poland in the past. Latvia was the big one, though, because that has never happened in Latvia before. And these drones came in through Belarusian airspace, which is a big move by Belarus and Russia. The response is confusing. In the eastern states, Poland, for example, has called for a big response from NATO. Poland has in the past, because, we know at least 2 of their civilians have been killed through things like this. 2 farmers killed back in 2022 during one of these massive air attacks on Ukraine. Poland has called for NATO to allow them to strike down any drones or missiles that are moving in the Polish direction. Other eastern states are similarly calling for a strong response, but then I guess in the West, in the western states of NATO, there is more of a pragmatic approach to this. So there's a sort of split response from NATO.
And the US still reluctant to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles against Russia, despite France and the UK being in favour. Are there any signs of a shifting on this by President Biden?
So interestingly on that, actually, the CIA boss, Bill Burns, was in London over the weekend, and he was talking at an event with his British counterpart. He was talking about how we don't need to be so worried about the Russian sort of nuclear bluff that they keep calling. And this is played into, has been read as playing into the Storm Shadow debate. So whether Ukraine is allowed to be using Western missiles to strike Russian infrastructure, it isn't so clear on what's happening with Biden and his team, Jake Sullivan, his advisor. It's not so clear when they will be shifting or if they will be shifting on this policy. Ukrainians are very hopeful, and Ukrainian sort of allies and Eastern NATO states are very hopeful that this will be pushed forward. But from Biden himself, there hasn't been any sign.
Mm-hmm. And morale for Ukrainians has been boosted in recent weeks with the incursion into Russia, the largest incursion into Russia since the Second World War. There's obviously concern for those at the front lines, but it has provided a bit of a lift after a difficult year. But in the past few months, there have been strategic strikes by Russia on Ukraine's energy system. We're about to go into winter. It is long and cold and dark in a Ukrainian winter. Are there concerns? Is there anything that anyone outside listening to this can do to help people in Ukraine?
Yes. So, I mean, last night, for example, 7 different regions in Ukraine had energy infrastructure targeted. 46 drones were shot down over Ukraine and 2 missiles. So these attacks are every single night, even if they don't make the Western headlines. And I think for Ukrainians, it's tricky. There's mixed messaging. There's been some changing around, if you can call it that, in the Ukrainian government. So the head of the energy company, or the sort of the government energy company, has been replaced with someone else. There has been some change, some shifting. So I think it's a moment of uncertainty. What will the winter bring? The last few days actually haven't seen such widespread power outages as the previous week had before. So I think in terms of Ukrainian morale with that, it's sort of about being as self-sufficient as possible, maybe not relying so much on government help, but being able to buy in generators. I think if any listeners are listening in thinking, how can they help? Donating to generator crowdfunding.
Great. Julia Lasker, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, the 79th United Nations General Assembly opens today in New York. But last week, the outgoing rotating president, Dennis Francis, wrote in an essay deriding the multilateral system that it's often been found wanting, unable to proactively respond with the speed, decisiveness and unity that the times demand. So is UNGA still fit for purpose, or is it merely an annual gathering for grandstanding leaders as conflicts continue to escalate across the globe? Well, joining us now is Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Scowcroft Centre for Strategy and Security. Elizabeth, thank you for coming on the show. Firstly, what can we expect from UNGA this year?
We can expect a lot of presentations by world leaders. They are coming later. So today, starting from today, we have so to speak, less important leaders, but that doesn't make this part of the UN General Assembly less important. What is important is that this is the only time in the year that leaders from at the top levels and further down get together in one place to discuss what ails the world and what can be done. There is no other such forum, and yes, people can criticize it, they can say it's insufficient. But what matters is that it's there, and it's the only such forum.
And conflicts are set to dominate discussions: Israel, Hamas, Ukraine, Syria, and Sudan. You're saying that, this is the only forum like it, and that's definitely true. But are we likely to see any kind of breakthroughs on any of these?
No, we are not. And one reason for that is that Vladimir Putin won't be there. There's obviously he's under sanctions and won't be able to travel to the US. Ordinarily, throughout history, because the UN is located in New York, the Americans have tried to make exceptions to visa rules for various leaders so that they could attend the UN General Assembly, because the UN just happens to be located in the United States, but Putin won't be coming. And so I think it's for that reason alone, it's unlikely that we'll see any sort of breakthrough regarding the Ukraine war, because for that breakthrough to happen, he would have to be in the room. Regarding Israel-Palestine, there will obviously be discussions at the UN General Assembly, and we should remember that what makes the UN General Assembly more important now than it used to be is that many of the members of the UN General Assembly, countries like India, like Brazil, they have gained clout in recent years simply because they've become economically more powerful. They are not on the Security Council, they are in the UN General Assembly, and they will have senior representatives there. And they are not just powerful economically and increasingly in foreign policy, but they also have the ambition to play a role in helping settle international issues.
Yeah, and in terms of the structure, the UN itself has been criticised in recent years for the voting system. And of course, you've touched on it, the UN Security Council, the permanent P5 members and calls to admit more of them, India and Brazil, would be likely candidates. Is there any chance or any groundswell building really to try to reform it?
No, and even if there were unanimity, if there were unanimity among the permanent members, yes, but clearly they are daggers drawn at the moment, so they would have to agree amongst themselves that this is what they want to do, and they are barely on speaking terms anymore. But the groundswell is certainly there. It's just outside the P5. It's clear to, I think, all the world's nations that the permanent 5 members, which were appointed right after World War II, that doesn't reflect the state of the world anymore. So the grounds is there. It just has to be within the P5 as well, and that's where it's not taking place.
And finally, other challenges are being discussed, like, for instance, this year, antimicrobial resistance. Is this a good forum for these kind of issues to build consensus on things that sort of aren't the front page stories but are important for humanity?
Yes, it is. We should remember that the UN has several different specialist organs, including the World Health Organization and so forth. But the UN General Assembly remains the one time of the year where national leaders get together all in the same place. And there are issues such as microbial resistance, such as climate change, such as the risk of more pandemics that go beyond the national interests of any given country, where countries do have to cooperate, where it's in their interest to cooperate. And the UN General Assembly, perhaps not in its formal proceedings, but through the fact that it gets all these leaders into the same building, can play that role. It can play a significant role in helping such conversations happen.
Elizabeth Braw, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now, the UK is no stranger to wind power. Benefiting from its breezy North Atlantic positioning, wind is indeed the largest source of renewable power in the country, producing around a quarter of the energy mix. Whilst wind farms are generally viewed favourably in the UK, a persistent complaint has been noise, and the motion has been subject to conspiracy theories about environmental impact. But now the country's first motionless system has been installed on a roof in Oxford by US company Aeromine. Joining us now is Paul Rincon, commissioning editor for science and technology at The Conversation. Paul, thank you for coming on the show. Firstly, can you explain how this new system works?
Yes, certainly. So Aeromine Technologies has built this essentially a wind turbine, but it doesn't look like the standard turbines that you have with 3 rotating blades. Instead, it's about 3 meters tall. It consists of a cylinder which contains a propeller inside, and 2 aerofoils, which are 2 sort of curved structures in front. what it does is exploits the fact that buildings tend to naturally accelerate wind due to their structure over the roofs. And the two aerofoils in front of the cylinder create a low pressure zone for any wind that sort of blowing in its direction. That low pressure zone drives the propellers within the cylinder behind those aerofoils, and that generates electricity essentially, through a generator that's linked to the structure itself. So the advantage of this versus something that, like a more standard conventional wind turbine, is that it's quieter, it's more compact, although 3 meters, so some of these wind turbines are much bigger than that. And it can be installed on roofs, flat roofs, essentially. So manufacturing plants, data centers, apartment buildings, offices. It's designed for that, and to be combined with solar panels. One of the other aspects to it is that it's environmentally friendly in the sense that, conventional wind turbines can kill birds. That's part of one of the downsides. And this doesn't do that, of course.
And there have been dubious claims as well. Obviously, that there has been an impact on birds, but there have been dubious claims about the motion and the likes of Donald Trump talking about, having cancerous effects and things like that. It can't be denied that at times there is noise from wind farms, isn't there? So is this a good solution to that?
Yes, I mean, in theory, this is, there's less noise with this particular model that's built by Aeromine. It's designed to be less noisy. You don't have these 3 rotating blades circulating all the time. It's a propeller, and it's contained within that structure, that cylindrical structure. So that reduces the noise. It won't be suitable for everything. These are really, won't replace those big wind turbines, which are designed to really, feed power to the grid, to power, thousands of homes per year. This is really for small scale applications. So, there aren't a lot of numbers on this just yet, because it's just been installed on a BMW factory in Oxford. But one unit is supposed to power the equivalent of maybe 3 or 4 households a year. So it's not insubstantial, and several of these things on maybe an office building combined with solar panels, when the sun shuts off at night, the wind turbine keeps going. So you have this combination of, to basically have consistency of power to whatever building that you're trying to power.
And in terms of pricing for manufacturing, obviously the sort of traditional wind farms that you see, they can be very tall. Here in the UK, until recently, they were only allowed to be built offshore. But is this a more cost-effective way of rolling out wind power around the country?
It could be. I mean, I think this is going to remain for very small scale applications. But, I think, this at the moment, Aeromine are designing this and sort of trialing it and aiming it at businesses that want to reduce their carbon emissions, perhaps reach net zero, the target where, emissions cancel out by 2030, 2050. And it's a very sort of niche market at the moment. I think as you go on, if the costs come down for this product, if it becomes sort of cost effective and the market grows for it, the sky's the limit really, and perhaps you could scale these turbines up. I mean that's sort of several steps forward, but the design seems to work. And yeah.
Paul Rincon, thank you very much. And that's all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Hassan Anderson. Our researchers were Gunnar Gronlid and Sana Jumani. And our studio manager was Flynn Simmons. I'm back with The Briefing at the same time tomorrow. If you've enjoyed the show, please do subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. Let us know what you've enjoyed listening to and what you would like to hear more of. And you can email me about any of the topics, vm@monocle.com. I'm Vincent McAviney. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.